Hello and welcome back to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we rank every politician and tell you who's winning and losing each week. This week I'm joined by Nadja.
Hello.
And Zach.
Hello.
Another little one this week. Another smaller panel. We got lots of sickly and holidaying people this week.
We do indeed.
So hope everyone watching is having a nice time. I don't know what I meant by that. I think I meant
hoping they weren't sick. I
hope
you're
people
well.
watching aren't sick.
Okay.
And if the sick people who work here are watching, get better soon.
What a lovely boss.
I'm not going to message them directly. I'm talking to them via the podcast. As always, this week we'll be running through some of our winners and some of our losers in politics this week, as well as taking on quite an interesting audience suggestion in the middle of the episode. Before we get to that though, let's begin with our winners this week. Okay, Zach, let's start with you. Who is your winner this week?
I think I've got quite an easy winner this week. It's going to be Portugal's, Prime Minister at the moment and presumably the next Prime Minister, Luis Montenegro, who is the leader of the sort of centre-right Democratic Alliance, which basically won a plurality of seats at last weekend's election. So we're recording this on Tuesday now.
Yeah.
We're recording this on Tuesday, and the election was held on Sunday. In short, he went into the election having sort of, I think, had about 80 seats out of 230. And I think there was a pretty strong, pretty broad consensus when the election was called that he would probably lose seats given it was his incumbent minority government that was taken down by a no confidence vote. But I think he basically successfully convinced some voters that he was their best chance at stability. Portugal has had basically 3 elections in 3 years and no stable majority government for a while now, basically since the socialists won a outright majority in 2022. And even then that government was not very, very stable. And yeah, he ended up with about 33% of the vote, plurality, significantly better than the second place socialists, who were sort of 23% of the vote, and 89 seats, which is still well short of a majority, right? And it leaves him a very familiar dilemma. And maybe this is too optimistic, but I think there is a world in which basically Montenegro has proved that he can benefit from political instability. He can use that to convince voters or sort of pitch to voters that I am the only chance at stability. There are echoes here of what happened back in the sort of like early 2010s in the UK, right? When the Tories were able to go with the rise of the SNP, we are now your only chance at stability. You can't vote for Labour. I mean, he can make that pitch at the next election. He'll be able to either increase his majority or at least like leverage the threat of that to force other parties in parliament to support his major bits of legislation. So I think pretty good result for him. And I think actually, not just that he outperformed expectations compared to sort of where they were when the election was called. If you just go on like Politico's poll of polls, you know, you can see that as he starts making that argument towards like the last couple of weeks of the campaign, there's a really steep uptick in support, and he sort of rises 4 or 5 points. So yeah, I think that is pretty good for him. There are 2 ways this could go, right? I mean, one is the sort of optimistic take I just provided, where he gets to leverage that argument and, you know, either gets more support in Parliament or goes into another election and gets even closer to a majority. But the pessimistic take is that you know, he ends up with another sort of unstable minority government, and voters tire of him and sort of the subsequent instability by the end of his next term or this term.
Well, for now, he's moving up. He's won the election. Sticking with the optimistic take for the moment. Also, worth noting, we put an axe over his head during the purge, and we said if he loses the election, he's immediately knocked off the board. And I think we ought to offer an official statement. We'll get some letter-headed paper out, write an official message to the presidency, and apologise for that axe.
We're sorry
and
for doubting
him. Because not only is he moving up, but he's also being de-axed in a real first for the leaderboard. You've said so many things already.
I say one other thing. I think one of the other things, I don't think we made this like sufficiently clear in the main video that we did over on TLDR EU. You know, I think it speaks to like it's quite a depressing political landscape for your medium Portuguese voter. You know, Montenegro was able to make that argument in large part because the Socialist Party under their new leader, I can't remember quite. It's Santos is his last name. You know, Santos. I always get confused, and I was going to get this reference.
Santos?
Yeah, Pedro Nuno Santos. I get him confused with the Wolves manager, former Espirito Nunes. Anyway,
we all do, to be fair. Portugal,
Yeah, what are we
Wolverhampton.
like? Yeah. But he's really unpopular and he's just a bad politician. And I think that the Andre Ventura, who's the leader of Chega, which is that new sort of right-wing anti-establishment party, it's the sort of Portuguese equivalent of all of those other similar parties that pop up across Europe at the moment. He's also, I think it's probably fair to say, he's not a particularly savvy politician. And Montenegro is not, he's not a great character either. But like compared to those two, I think he just looks like a safe pair of hands, right? But in a way, that's depressing for the medium Portuguese voter, because you're just basically left with the least bad of three quite bad options. So yeah, I think that's something that's worth mentioning, and I think it actually speaks to a bit of a chronic problem in lots of European democracies, in that the caliber of politician does feel, at least to most voters, like it's gone down over time. I think it's something that many European viewers will probably feel familiar with, maybe even American viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. On the Chega point quickly, that is obviously what a lot of people are looking at going into the election, seeing would they gain even more seats. They obviously did well in the last election, have been growing. We've been looking at the kind of rising anti-establishment far right parties across Europe for a while now. This is obviously a different story, that the kind of more center right, traditional right, has been able to fight back and re-establish themselves a bit. Do we think this is a negative sign for Chega, or is this more just like a unique instance of they're sick of so many elections back to back and effectively choosing a more radical, unusual, change-making party is the last thing they want?
Can I make a point?
Yeah, go for it. Treat yourself.
I think because I'm writing a script about this right now, so there'll be a video out on a very similar topic over on TLDR EU.
Wow,
next
what
time
a
or something.
plug.
But I think a lot that's happening, like in the US and with Trump returning to the White House presidency, has caused something of a kind of return to the more centrist parties across Europe. Like we did see in the past kind of 2 years maybe since COVID, that a lot of voters have been flocking to the more radical parties. And that's still the case, definitely. Like, compared to 5 years ago, the voter base for, I don't know, the AfD in Germany is like triple what it was, if not more.
And even growing still.
But at the same time, the kind of chaotic nature of the US presidency and the impacts it has for Europe has kind of meant maybe that the popularity for the more centrist, stable kind of parties and figures is making a bit of a return.
Yeah.
That's just what I was gonna say.
No, honestly, I think that's I don't really sound condescending, but I think it's a great point, and I wasn't gonna mention it, but I think that's very, very true. And you do see that. I think you saw that a little bit in the UK as well, right? With Farage having to sort of distance himself from Trump for electoral reasons.
Yeah.
I think that one of the other things I was going to say, and again, I'm sort of reaching for a UK analogy here in a terribly provincial manner, but the other thing I was going to say is that Chega, unlike, let's say, Reform in the UK, who was surging in the polls, Chega did well at the last election, right? Last year's election, they got sort of 18% of the vote. They came third. They made it very, very difficult for the two traditional major parties to form functioning coalitions. And that has meant that this time around, they've come under a bit more scrutiny, right? Because this time they can everyone knows they're a real challenger and that they could actually play a role in government. And so they didn't have the luxury that upstart parties usually do, when they can just sort of say a whole load of popular things without anyone really being like, oh, how is this costed? Would this actually work? And there were a couple of debates with Andre Ventura, who's again the leader of Chega. And there's a pretty widespread consensus that he sort of underperformed in those debates. And then when pressed on the sort of details of his policy, he couldn't really come up with anything. And it just makes you look sort of negative and critical, not constructive, and not sort of fit for government in that sense. The one other thing I would say is that, of course, Chega they still did quite well, and they still ended up sort of 22% of the vote. But I think it's worth noting that, Portugal, the centre has held for quite a long time in Portugal in the way that it didn't necessarily in other European countries. In the 2010s, at the same time as there was that sort of wave of, I think that's when these new anti-establishment migrant parties were sort of just coming up. There was a lot of commentary about how in Portugal and Spain, those two electorates seemed slightly immune to that trend, despite the fact that at the time their economies were doing pretty badly.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying that I think, don't want to generalize too aggressively here, but Portugal has a history of relatively moderate, at least in the recent term.
Interesting. Well, the axe is removed and he's moving up to the middle. which feels like a good place to be at the beginning of a new political term. We'll see how it plays out, how the electorate respond in weeks to come. Nadia, let's move over to you. Who is your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is the Albanian Prime Minister, Edi Rama. Similar reasons that Zach has picked Luis Montenegro for. There were elections last Sunday in Albania, parliamentary elections, and Edi Rama won the majority. He won 52.1% against this main opposition bloc led by Sali Berisha. And this is basically his 4th term now in office. So he's been in power for quite a while now, and he's managed to kind of push his popularity and ride this wave of pro-EU sentiment that's been taking over Albanians and Albanian youth particularly. He's kind of brandished himself as the only leader in Albania that can get Albania into the EU bloc by 2030. And I guess a lot of people believe in that platform that he's putting on. In general, aside from winning his now 4th election, he is also considered in Europe and across the world, but Europe in particular, is quite a popular figure as well. Not so much just a stable figure for the Balkans and for the wider region, but also in the sense of he's been kind of a really strong partner for certain European countries when it comes to issues of migration. He signed off a deal with Italy, with Giorgia Meloni to take in some of the asylum seekers coming into Italy and keep them in Albania while their applications are being processed. And now, all of a sudden, a lot of leaders, including our own Keir Starmer, wants to get on board and sign deals off with Edi Rama. So the European leaders, their hands are all over Edi Rama right now, trying to get a deal. But what was quite interesting is that he said, no, Italy is a specific case. And he said to Keir Starmer, we're not having it. We're not having any of your asylum seekers, which is kind of it's a bit of a big thing to say, no, just like that. Especially, I think it was in front of a conference as well. And I don't think Keir Starmer was prepared for that rejection. But essentially, that's so Edi Rama, he's obviously polling well. He's the prime minister once again. And he's kind of places himself as quite a strategic leader in the coming years for the Balkans and the wider European continent in general. So he's winner of the week.
Interesting. 4th term is pretty impressive, to be fair, these days. Can't argue with that. Edi Rama being added to the lightly positive section of the board, a new addition.
Yes. New addition as well.
Always fun to get a new addition. As you mentioned, obviously, one of the major factors here is EU membership and kind of growing integration with Europe. 2030 being the goal feels ambitious.
Very ambitious, in my opinion.
I was going to ask, what are your thoughts on 2030, which I think we can all say feels unlikely, but also on just their accession hopes generally, because there's a lot of countries in that region that this is like a live issue, some keener than others, but like there's a whole pool of countries there that are being discussed.
Yeah.
Where does Albania stack up versus the others?
Well, so definitely Albania, along with perhaps Montenegro, are the two front runners for sure. I think there's maybe 8 other or 9 other candidate countries in the Balkans, and then you've got Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, I think now. Yeah, Ukraine as well, technically. Definitely they are in the front runners because with the whole EU accession process, it requires a country to open and close 35 chapters, which are just basically policy areas, different policy areas that the country has to fulfill, whether it's whether it's getting rid of corruption or whether it's, strengthening judicial institutions, And they've progressed the most along with Montenegro. And Edi Rama, he's obviously played a really big role in that as well. And he's kind of, in the past couple of years, painted this kind of picture of Albania as this kind of European tourist destination spot, and he's getting loads of investment in from like creating the new Albanian Riviera, and it's kind of just like bigging it up to be a much more like, well, it is a lovely place, but also just, making it seem like, it's a very, investment place to invest. At the same time, major corruption problems, like insane corruption problems. And that's kind of been pushed to the side for the sake of investment, for the sake of pushing other things. And a lot of young voters actually are quite disillusioned with that kind of idea that they can get into the EU by 2030 when corruption is still incredibly widespread. So, but he's got a bit of a balancing act to do, and he definitely hasn't, I don't think, cleared the path for 2030 completely. Challenges ahead.
But he has done a good job with the image thing, hasn't he? I mean, it's quite impressive because Nadia's entirely right. There are still sort of like long-standing corruption issues, but people do think of Albania in very sort of like friendly terms. There's like most Europeans have very positive opinions of Albania and of Eddie Rama. He goes on like the rest is politics. You've seen him there, he's very charming.
With trainers. He always wears trainers, like white trainers everywhere.
And he has that. Whenever he talks about the EU, he has that. I don't know if you've ever heard, but he has that. He has this metaphor that he goes back to, where he says that they're like the jilted bride waiting at the altar. Yeah. And he has this little like spiel he does, and all the European leaders like, ha. So it's very entertaining. But I mean, I think he's a very savvy politician.
He like knelt down, like he said they had like a security conference as well in Turin. And he was hosting it. And like Meloni was coming down the carpet and he like knelt down and namaste'd her. It's just such a, I don't know, interesting thing to do.
He's welcome on the podcast. If he wants to be on World Leader Leaderboard, he can come, right?
Yeah.
Official invite, as can Luis Montenegro if he forgives us for the axe incident. Okay, cool. So those are our 2 winners this week. And a new addition to the board. Before we move to the audience suggestion, which is the next point, a quick special shout out to our magazine, Too Long, which we talk about regularly. But before you fast forward, you should know that this week only you can get 30% off any of the back catalogue. If you thought that you couldn't complete your collection because they're out of stock, we've restocked and you can get 30% off all of them by using code 30. That's the word 30. But that ends this Sunday, the 25th of May. And I wanted to quickly reflect on this most recent issue because we obviously spoke about it a lot kind of in the first half of this year. And I think to some extent that's made it feel like it's been out forever. But I think this issue is still really fresh and really interesting, partly because of what it's about. This issue, as I'm sure you're aware, is about the world's most influential people as ranked by you and the TLDR team. We combined together your votes to create the top 25 and we wrote about all of the top 25. And I think almost more than any other issue of Too Long, this is relatively evergreen stuff. And I think even if you haven't picked up a copy yet, this is still really interesting content. I mean, with the exception maybe of the article about the Pope, which is interesting but less relevant. I think the rest of the list really stands up and there's still some really great content here. I think we can reveal a couple of people on the list if you'd like. So Nadia and Zach, do you want to pick someone that you wrote about that you think is interesting that maybe we haven't spoken about before? Who did you write about on the list that you liked your article of? Zach, do you have anyone in particular?
Oh, it's a very on brand and maybe a bit boring to the medium viewer, but I did like writing about Jamie Dimon.
Yeah.
So you knew it was coming. Or maybe Jerome Powell. I think both of those, in a sense, look a little bit prescient, given that, well, I mean, obviously Powell has really stood up to Trump and successfully sort of forced him to back down when it comes to threatening to sack Powell. But also, I don't know, people might not pay that much attention to this, but Jamie Dimon has come out and quite explicitly criticized Trump's economic policies. He gave an interview with Bloomberg very recently saying that the tariffs were going to push the US, or that the recession risk from tariffs was sort of underestimated. And then more recently, another interview where he sort of implicitly criticized proposals by Trump to deregulate the banking sector, saying that there are real credit risks that people aren't really paying attention to. And I think that what's turned out to be quite interesting is that one of the most sort of immediate constraints on Trump's room for maneuver is finance, right? And that he just really does care about what Wall Street thinks and how the S&P 500 is doing, and especially the Treasury market. And one of the things that's really important here and the Treasury market is like probably the most immediate, most direct constraint on Trump's room for maneuver. When Treasury yields go a bit too high, he normally U-turns. I think that's the thing that pushed him over the edge on tariffs, right? And JP Morgan just does play a really pivotal role in sort of market making the Treasury market, right? Providing liquidity to the Treasury market. And in that sense, Trump really needs Jamie Dimon.
Jamie Dimon and Jerome Powell both on the list. Jerome Powell, we can exclusively reveal, number 12. Here we go.
12.
And the question of the article, can power resist Trump, as you say, feels very prescient still. We ranked him as the 9th most influential person in the world. The audience put him at 20, with 0.4% of people putting him as their number 1, which feels higher than you'd expect. 9% putting him in its top 10, putting him in their top 10.
9% of people.
Yeah.
That's actually really quite high, isn't it?
These are the interesting stats you get from the magazine. Nadia, who did you write about that you thought was interesting?
I was flicking through now to think of. I mean, they're all very timely.
What a beautiful thing! What a beautiful thing to be flicking through.
Yeah, it feels amazing. I wrote about Erdogan and about the Turkish army and how it's Oh, well, we're showing. Yep, there he is. Ranked. Where is he ranked?
He is number 11.
11, yeah.
0.4% of voters putting him as their number 1 and 13% in the top 10.
Amazing. I wrote about the growing military Turkish complex across the world. Well, not actually across the world, but like neighboring countries.
It's pretty global. He's
it is
he's got
pretty
fingers
global.
and lots of pies.
Yeah. Dipped into, He dips his toes into...
Dips his toes.
Is that thing?
Getting all the digits out.
The most recent story being the Kurdish militant group, the Workers' Kurdish Party, being kind of, demolished. Not demolished, disbanded, that's the word. After 40 years, which is insane. And probably a lot of that is to do with like Kurdish politics and, Erdogan's reapproachment of Kurdish politicians, but it's also probably to do with the fact that the Turkish army has kind of battered them quite a bit and they're a lot weaker than they once were. And that's quite a big major development. So I think that article on the Turkish army and its influence in the region and across the globe is quite timely and it's a good read, if I do say so.
There you go.
Just to back it up, I think super timely, given that, Europe has been sort of conspicuously quiet about Erdogan's more authoritarian moves recently, in large part because Europe, needs Turkey to help it negotiate peace in Ukraine. And also, at least some European politicians want Turkey to help it guarantee peace in Ukraine, right? Turkey, if you're looking at sort of standing armies, is one of the biggest in NATO.
It's a lot. That's a great example, much better example.
Sorry, I didn't want to steal limelight, but
really
I thought,
good. Yeah, I
you
didn't
were
even think of
underselling
that.
yourself there, that's all.
Well, you can read about all of that and much more. You can read about the entire top 25, learn who made the list. There's some interesting people in there, some you might not expect, some non-political people too. Interesting to see us writing about non-political people too. I was going to say who it was, but I'm not going to. You need to buy it. More than that, though, we talk about UK politics. We talk about the rise of the new right in Europe. We talk about Ukraine. We talk about Trump and all of his first months in power. We talk about whether there'll ever be peace in Gaza. We talk about all kinds of stuff. So if you want to pick up a copy, it is as relevant as ever, and you can find out who the most influential people are and get 30% off by using code 30 at checkout, but only until this Sunday. Okay, so let's move on to the audience's suggestion now. Every week, we let the audience choose someone in the comment section who will either be added to the board or moved on the board. And then the team get to decide what happens to them. Do they go up? Do they go down? But you get to suggest who it is we talk about. Our number one comment this week was a nomination for the guy who always nominates the African dictator. Unfortunately, we can't add commenters to the board, especially meta commentary to the board. So we won't be adding the guy to the board. But number 2 comment this week was from the guy who always nominates the African dictator. So we will, in a roundabout way, be doing what was requested, and we'll be adding Ibrahim Traore. Who is the suggestion. For people who are unfamiliar, Nadia, who is this person?
He is the leader of Burkina Faso. He came to power following the 2022 coup. And I want to say he's the president, not prime minister.
Yeah, he's the president.
Yeah, president. He's kind of developed a bit of a insane following across Africa, or especially in Burkina Faso, as some kind of messianic figure, anti-colonial figure as well. His kind of whole platform has been to push Western powers out of the Sahel, out of Burkina Faso. And he's not the only leader doing so. There's a handful of countries in Africa, and particularly in sub-Saharan and in the Sahel region that have kind of taken a turn against these kind of post-colonial, or you could still say colonial countries that have been present. So in this case, France for Burkina Faso, they kind of exited. I think I'm not exactly sure the timelines, but France did exit Burkina Faso following pressure to do so. France was their kind of like security guarantor for quite a while, but they said enough's enough. We can take care of our own security. We can take care of our own country. That's a kind of argument he's been pushing for, and as a result, the president, who's also the youngest president the country has ever had, he's around 38 years old or something, which is kind of is very young. It's not just for, I mean, I don't know who else.
He also looks younger. I mean, I don't want to.
He does, yeah.
This shouldn't really be the focus of the podcast, but I think he looks like he's in his.
He's one of the youngest looking people on the board, I got to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That actually is definitely a genuine. Sorry, do you
mind? No, yes,
just on that point, that is like a genuine cause for his popularity, right? In that it's a sort of truism about African politics that Africa as a continent is very, very young. I think the median age in Burkina Faso is like 17, 18.
Yeah.
But African leaders have tended to be very, very old. There are a handful of African countries with leaders now well into their 80s, and I think the median age, I can't remember what the precise number is, but it used to be about 70. It might be a bit lower now.
Yeah. Still far older than.
It's a massive generational gap, right, between the median voter and the median leader.
I think it was 63. I think I read.
That's good. Thank you very much. But it's a massive gap, and the fact that he's a young dude, I think, does make him popular. I think there's a couple of other things that might, again, the anti-Western element, sort of anti-France element. That's clearly something that chimes with a lot of.
There's drilling going on.
That's clearly something that chimes with a lot of young Africans. And I think the last thing that's worth mentioning, just in sort of like we're talking about broad strokes, is that he's obviously sort of like pitched himself as a military strongman, right? He always turns up in military fatigues to anything. I think it was the Ghanaian presidential inauguration, and all the other African leaders were there, and he turned up with a pistol in his fatigues and his gloves and his beret, and everyone went wild for it. They loved it. And I think those are all like genuine reasons why he probably is popular with basically lots of young Africans. But I think you have to be careful. I think quite a lot of this is very online, right? In that he's got a big social media platform, but he's got a sort of like social media alliance with sort of anti-Western right-wingers from China, from Russia especially, right? So I follow a whole load of like big like pro-Russia accounts on.
Of course you do.
Yeah, of course I did. But it was good, useful during the Ukraine to see what the other side was thinking. And they love him. And they're always sort of like reposting him and sort of reposting like anti-French content. And actually there's also a whole load of sort of right-wing anti-Western American influencers, right? Very MAGA coded to be sort of anti-Western and sort of, America first, get out of Africa sort of thing. And it's very hard to tell how much of it is just online, right? And how much of it is genuinely representative of his actual popularity in Burkina Faso. And lots of the sort of pro Ibrahim Traore content you see online is just sort of like AI deepfake stuff. And there's no real like substance to it. I think the other point that's worth making is the only thing we have really good data on, right, is actually the sort of conflict numbers. And you'd never know what would have happened in the relevant counterfactual. But basically, since they kicked the French out, the various sort of Islamist insurgencies in Burkina Faso and neighboring Sahel countries have actually got slightly worse, at least if you measure like by number of attacks, by number of people killed. Both of those have gone up by sort of 20, 30% between 2022 and 2024, according to the most recent data I could find. And insofar as that's reflective of like his governance abilities, I think doesn't bode very well. But you see what the point I'm trying to make, right? Is like so much of this is super online. I think the fact that we're even talking about it is simply the fact that it's super online and people want to hear about it. And I guess the question is like, how is Twitter real life? And for a long time, the answer has been no. Maybe it's less. Maybe there is more. Of an overlap now, but I think that's the question, really, right? Yeah,
and I suppose how his ability to get a handle on governance and actually leading the country, and whether these policies of kind of anti-Western, anti-colonial kind of approaches actually do translate to positive real world outcomes. I mean, obviously there's the kind of ideological argument there, but if then the security risk suddenly increases and there's big issues in the country, you can see that argument starts to look weaker. So
yeah, and he's replaced the French, French with some Russians.
Yeah.
There was the Wagner group had a presence in the Sahel for a while, but the Russian footprint is very, very small for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
Because the Wagner and the other sort of like state adjacent paramilitaries have been wound down after the whole fiasco when what's his name marched on Moscow, Prigozhin marched on Moscow. They've all been wound down, and Russia obviously doesn't have like spare manpower that they can offer, lend to those African states. The fact that there are only, the estimates I saw put it at about 200 Russian troops there suggests that the Russians aren't really there to help Burkina Faso fight ISIS. They're mainly there to guarantee Traore's, position at the top, right? So I think that doesn't necessarily bode well for Burkina Faso more widely. The last thing, I can say one more.
You can say one more thing. One more teensy thing.
The only real actual policy sense we have from him, right, is that he likes nationalizing industries. It's a sort of Burkina Faso first policy thing. And I think it's a very noble ambition, right? So he's basically tried to nationalize some gold mines in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is gold plays a very big part in Burkina Faso's economy. It's otherwise a very, very poor country. And he's tried to develop a sort of refining industry in Burkina Faso. So instead of exporting just raw gold, which is then refined abroad, it's refined there and you can sort of move up the value chain. I think these are noble aspirations, but whether or not Burkina Faso, the government of Burkina Faso can do that, can successfully run a gold industry and then a gold refining industry. I think that's an open question. And it depends on the sort of capacity of the state in that respect. And there are lots of reasons to think that the Burkina Faso state isn't actually that capable, not least because it's changed hands every couple of years for the past couple of decades.
Well, we have to decide whether he's winning or losing, and neither of you has said yet. And I also don't know if I can fully tell from what you have said whether he is winning or losing. So, Nadja, do you want to start? Winner or loser this week?
I think everything Zach said is true. And at the same time, if I'm just thinking about polling and popularity, he's a winner.
Yeah, for the same reason, I'm going to put him up.
Okay. Ibrahim Traore is moving up on the board, being added and then being shifted up to the lightly positive section. And rather appropriately, he is wearing a beret on the board too. In fact, the first person wearing a hat on the board. Right. Got a headscarf kind of thing, but an actual hat. It's the first hat. It's a big moment for the board, I would say. Let's move on and let's move to our losers of the week. Okay, Zach, let's start with you. Who is your loser this week?
My loser of the week is going to be Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. I think I put him down, or someone put him down. You put him down last week, and I nearly stole him off you last week.
I put him down the week before. Sorry.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we put him down last week because it did look like Trump was slightly souring on him. I think that has continued. I think that the most explicit bit of evidence we have to suggest that is a report by Israeli media that Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, told the families of the other hostages that haven't been released. He basically sort of came out and said very explicitly, look, it's Netanyahu's fault that the war isn't being wound down. He doesn't want peace, and we want peace. That's pretty terrible for Netanyahu. But I think the other thing is that Netanyahu's decision to continue and escalate the war in Gaza recently has provoked a fair bit of outrage from sort of Israel's traditional Western allies, right? Most notably in Europe. So I think at the moment you have the UK, France, and Canada all threatening targeted sanctions. The rhetoric that we saw from countries like Spain and Slovenia, who've always been slightly less pro-Israel than other European countries, has taken things up a notch. I think Pedro Sanchez said he's going to start referring to Israel as just a genocidal state. I think that the sort of accelerating international isolationism of Israel will eventually bite, or it sort of has to, I think. And I think it speaks to this long-running tension, right, between the domestic incentives for Netanyahu and the international incentives. And domestically, he has this incentive to appease the sort of far-right ministers, in his government because he needs them to keep everything afloat. Whereas obviously there's a lot of international pressure to wind things down, to de-escalate in Gaza. And there's always been this tension, but he was able to sort of paper over it both because Biden and then Trump until a couple of months ago were quite supportive of his war in Gaza, but also because for a while it looked like the war in Gaza was sort of escalating into a regional war against Iran, right? And that sort of reframed the whole, well, basically the entire conflict. And it turned what had, the Israel-Palestine issue into an Israel-Iran regional war, and the alliances are slightly more complicated in that instance. But that's no longer the case. I mean, obviously Trump is quietly turning on Israel, and then also, Iran has signaled very, very heavily that it doesn't want a regional war, most obviously by pushing for a new deal with Trump. So neither of those solutions are available to Netanyahu anymore, and that basic tension between the domestic and the international incentives is really coming to light.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what do you make of this? You obviously moved him recently, as you say. What are your perceptions of the last week or so versus when we last had this conversation?
Sure. I think I'd say I'm a bit less optimistic in the sense of how many nations, and specifically European nations, are turning away from Israel. I do still think that, I mean, we had the whole France and Macron saying, he made like a lot of comments about Israel and Netanyahu that caused a lot of backlash in Israel, and Netanyahu then jibbed back at him, and Belgium came out in support of France as well, and then we had the whole Eurovision thing as well with Belgium, and I think it was Belgium and Spain. They're broadcasting before the show began. They broadcasted on the screens that So I don't exactly remember what the message was, but it was a kind of anti-Israel message, and for the fact that they were in the show and still performing and stuff like that.
And they didn't win either.
Yeah, the second to last. Well,
second.
No, came second, not second to last.
They came second.
They nearly won.
How did you not see this drama? You started. I thought.
I don't follow.
No,
neither did I. But
they
even
nearly won. That was like the last seconds of the show were like it's either Israel or
I
Austria.
thought it was second to last.
No. It's because we should cut this, but like
this is Eurovision is politics.
It's politics, yeah. Even though Eurovision says it's not political,
it became obviously like a whole like Israel Palestine thing, right? But then obviously if you want to vote against Israel, you obviously have how many options it is to choose
25 other countries.
Whereas if you want to, everyone who wanted to sort of like show their support for Israel coalesced around Israel. And
the British public put them as number one.
That's insane.
And lots of other countries.
Yeah, loads of countries. They would cause a complete meltdown on like all of the.
You could see the hosts
the Eurovision forums because obviously they're generally quite left leaning.
You could see the hosts even were panicking at the end. Like there was real tension in the room. You should watch the clip.
I was at barbecue.
It's interesting. But they didn't win. This campaign didn't work. And as you say, countries are pushing back, and various countries are pressuring the EBU at this stage to get rid of Israel.
Well, even the fact that that
the
whole situation happened,
obviously,
but even the fact, I think that speaks for itself. I don't think there is quite enough momentum yet to completely isolate Netanyahu.
When I said it aloud, I was like, when I said it has to bite at some point. I was like, well, does it? Like it hasn't bitten so far. I think ultimately it just depends on America. In lots of ways, right? Like I think that, I don't really have faith in the Europeans to collectively do enough to make a difference. Yeah. So I've completely taken. Now just convinced me that I was wrong in the first place.
No.
But I agree. Like I don't think that the targeted sanctions they're not gonna stop Netanyahu. No. The only meaningful thing will be some sort of intervention from the US, and even then, I think in a way that's an open question, right? Like Israel doesn't rely on the US in the way that it used to. It's a rich country; it can fund its war. But now that I'm flip-flopping endlessly here, the one other thing I would say is, well, if we're talking about Eurovision, we can talk about this. Yeah. Is that, and one of the things you have seen quite sharply recently is that a lot of the sort of like MAGA adjacent influencers and like online figures, Joe Rogan is a good example, Theo Von, I don't know how much he interviewed Trump during the campaign. They have both started becoming quite a lot more critical of Israel. And I think there was good reason to think that Trump is quite responsive to the sort of demands.
They're critical of Israel on what grounds? On like America First, we shouldn't be interested, or like, and actually like what they're doing is bad.
I don't think those guys are like that political.
They've not thought through that
well, it sort of depends who you're talking about, right? But I think you like the Rogan. I don't know enough about this to go in too much. Too much depth. Who's Joe Rogan? But I think it's more just that they are, they're guys who sort of like skim social media, and they've started having, Rogan has more and more sort of like conspiracy theorist guests on, and those guys often have a slightly anti-Israel, sometimes anti-Semitic bent. And I think that has probably pushed them around a little bit. But I also just think that, like, for lots of people, their understanding of that war is just what you get from social media, right? And it's very hard to have an opinion. It's very hard to not want that to stop, right? To just see sort of endless horrifying videos. And if you're just a normal person, you just think, well, this shouldn't happen.
This feels bad.
Yeah, this feels bad. We should stop this. You see what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
That was, I don't know, I guess Theo Von did a thing that popped up on my YouTube. I don't know how interesting this is to people, but where he was saying, he's not a political guy, but he has a massive audience. And there is a bit of overlap between the sort of like the Rogan sphere, right? And the sort of young Republican base that makes up the core of MAGA. Yeah. And he was just saying, I just see a video of, a parent carrying the sort of dismembered body of their child. And I just think, like, I'm not into politics, but this can't really happen. This shouldn't be happening, right? And I think that's a pretty widespread sentiment. Yeah.
It'll be interesting as well. I mean, he is at the bottom of the board already, whacking against the bottom yet again. It will be interesting. Like, this is beyond, we won't be doing the podcast at this point, but in decades' time, how this is perceived, that like right now we're so in the middle of it, and it feels that like there's such strong opinions. And I do wonder, with conflicts like this and with things like this historically, normally there's a real consensus that's reached at some point about like who was good and who was bad. And I wonder,
but I think, so for what it's worth, I think demographics make that conclusion. I think even leaving aside who you actually think is on the wrong and in the right, if you're pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, whatever, demographics and the way that public opinion changes over generations, the fact, basically, what I'm getting at here is that younger people are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine relative to their older peers, especially in the US. I think, we'll look back on this in decades' time and everyone will think, that was a genocide. Yeah. I think that will be the consensus take.
Okay.
But yeah, and I just think that as that generation grows up and accounts for the majority of the electorate, and assuming that younger generations still follow that trend of being sort of more pro-Palestine than pro-Israel, then I think that's where we'll end up.
Well, we'll see where he is on the leaderboard in 2048, and we'll loop back.
Do you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Nadia, who is your loser of the week?
My loser of the week is the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. That being, he made a bit of a blunder last week, a bit of a political blunder, foreign policy blunder. That's not gone down very well. He essentially endorsed the Romanian presidential candidate, the hard right, far right, nationalist, whatever you want to say, Romanian candidate, George Simion, who didn't win in the end, but this was before polling day. He endorsed him in the sense of standing together with his politics, with that kind of sovereigntist, Christian kind of vibe that Simion also, that's his kind of platform as well.
Anti-EU as well.
Anti-EU, yeah. But that was that's kind of been cited now as the biggest mistake that Orban has made. Essentially, to give a bit of context, there's around 1 million Hungarians that live in Romania, and George Simion is one of the newest kind of figures in a really long history that has kind of perpetuated anti-Hungarian sentiment. There's a lot going on there. Ethnic tensions for decades, not maybe to a hardcore extent, like, I don't know, Yugoslavia or something like that, but there's definitely been a lot of ethnic tensions between the Hungarians living in Romania and Romanians, which the hard right nationalist parties always kind of used, and have kind of pushed that sentiment. The reason why Orban endorsed Simion is essentially because he kind of saw it as, okay, if Simion gets into the presidency, then I'll have another buddy alongside my Slovakian buddy Fico to kind of veto everything the EU does. And that'd be great for me. Like, I can do this, I can do that, whatever. But instead, what happened was the Hungarian party in Romania backlashed against Orban completely, and they said, well, what the hell, why are you endorsing this guy? Do you know what he's been saying about us? And all this, that's completely wrong to endorse him. And everyone has just there's just been a massive uproar against Viktor Orban for essentially picking these kind of extra EU realpolitik kind of issues over the kind of electorate, the Hungarian electorate. He's already suffering pretty badly. Like, his polling has dropped, and the opposition party led by Peter Magyar is for the first time ahead of his Fidesz party in the polls. And even Peter Magyar used this situation again to make a jib at Orban, saying, yeah, you've made a mess out of everything. You've sold out Hungarian people for your own extra outer EU kind of politics. So he's down this week. He's going to lose this week.
Reaching the bottom of the board too.
Is it?
Bottom of the board's getting crowded. Well, not that crowded, but there's three people down there. Zach, what do you make of this? The kind of balance Orban is playing and the kind of
I completely agree.
Domestic versus European.
Well, I like Naja's framing there, right? In that, I think that Orban has sort of nurtured this sense in Hungary and Hungarian politics that the sort of establishment politicians are too focused on Europe, and we need to be more focused on their sort of national politics. Right? And he's fallen into his own trap in a way, right? And that he's all of a sudden looks sort of slightly preoccupied with EU-level machinations and blind to the sort of wants and desires of ordinary Hungarians.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's proven so politically toxic for him, right? The last thing I'll say is that also, I think this is and there's a couple of examples recently, right, where Orban's foreign policy hasn't necessarily worked brilliantly. So obviously there was his general affinity towards Putin, which I think has sort of backfired in certain respects. But then more recently, there's been this tension that I think you might have talked about on a podcast or written about in a video, between he's got a very pro-Trump, but simultaneously very pro-China.
Yeah.
And especially on economic and trade issues, right? He's sort of accepted a whole load of Chinese investment. I mean, people might know that BYD, that very, very famous Chinese electric car company, is setting up its first European plant in Hungary. Obviously that has gone down pretty badly with Trump, right? Because Trump's whole thing is about sort of, getting America's allies on side in this sort of looming economic war with China. What I think is very interesting about this is that Hungarian foreign minister or finance minister was asked about this very, very directly. And he said, if the Americans do try and force you to stop trading with China, what will you do? And he actually answered very explicitly. And he said, no, we won't do that. We will continue to trade with China. China is a very important trade partner to Hungary at this point, and we can't decouple like the US can, which I think is interesting.
And Nadia, what do you think about this kind of longer term? Obviously, you say there's this kind of, he's declining in the polls. He's got various issues at the moment, kind of domestically and internationally. Do you think this is kind of a beginning of the end, kind of downfall of Orban? Or do you think it's more likely he can bounce back still?
I think there's two ways this can go. I think the first way, and probably the most probable situation, is that he'll continue kind of maintaining his grip on power and squeezing out the kind of independency of judicial institutions, the media. He's just passed a new bill, the Foreign Agents Bill, which is a really similar bill that's been passed in Russia and in Georgia, that basically suppresses any kind of media freedoms from the foreign agent actors or whatever. So I think if he does continue and he is successful in kind of this kind of state capture of all of Hungary's institutions, he will stay in power for a while. On the other hand, if there's a surge, which we've already seen for the opposition, we still have 1 more year to go until elections, if not a bit longer, maybe a year and a half. And it really does depend on if that opposition is able to kind of sustain this momentum that they've been on for quite a while now, for the past year and a half as well. And that'll take a lot. So, and if they are successful, then definitely there is a chance that Orban can be kicked out of power, but we've still got quite a while to the elections, but I guess we'll see soon.
For now, though, he's reached the bottom of the board, which brings us to the final segment of the show, our ultimate winners and ultimate losers of the week. Okay, so to close, we are now going to select our ultimate winner and ultimate loser of the week. And the way this works, each of us will get the opportunity to write down one person who we're voting for as the biggest winner or biggest loser of the week. If we have a consensus, that person moves up or down one more place. If we don't, then we move on and the world continues. Your options for the ultimate winner of the week are Luis Montenegro, Eddie Rama, or Ibrahim Traore. Okay, Nadia, who is your ultimate winner of the week?
My ultimate winner of the week is Eddie Rama for winning an election, for starting his 4th term, and for just being a likable character.
We're just desperate to get him on the show.
Yeah, please, Eddie.
Please, Eddie.
Yeah, I concede. No, concur. I concur. I also concede. I mean, I sort of my guy doesn't go up, but I think Rama is pretty clear winner. I mean, 4 terms is pretty crazy. 4 elections and a win, and also Montenegro did win, but he won a plurality.
Yeah,
Rama did win a majority.
Agreed. Same logic.
Whoa.
4th time.
Yeah, it's happened.
Majority.
Yeah, baby.
And also just such a chill, nice guy, and we get on so well. We take him for lunch.
Yeah.
Take him to Jerry's Hot
We'd
Subs.
split it 50-50,
Okay, so your options for loser of the week are Netanyahu or Orban. Either way here, the person can't move again because they're already on the bottom of the board. But as suggested by the audience, we will be tracking how many times these people bump up against the top and the bottom. So the people at the top and bottom will add a little number next to them, which indicates how many spots above or below they ought to be were the leaderboard infinite. But just for kind of space on screen reasons, the leaderboard is not infinite. So they'll be adding a little tally next to their name, depending on who you pick. Nadia, who is your ultimate loser this week?
My ultimate loser of the week is Benjamin Netanyahu. Just being a loser.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree. I know we talked it through and there are like ups and downs to it, but I do just think quite fundamentally, it does really feel like Trump is turning on Netanyahu. And I think that the things that, Israel and Netanyahu could previously rely on, the sense of safeguards that they could rely on to prevent too drastic a change in American policy no longer exists, given that Trump basically decides everything himself, right? There are no sort of structural guardrails against him really ditching Israel.
I agreed. Netanyahu as well.
Wow.
Netanyahu came second in Eurovision. Tried to win, tried to rig it, didn't work. Orban didn't even take part. Hungary haven't competed since 2019. So,
That's good. Yeah. Is there a reason?
Sorry?
Is there a reason?
You can just choose not to. Like some countries.
Yeah, but why? Why do they choose?
I mean, generally because they just lose a lot. And
I was going to say because they're not really.
Probably that too.
Yeah.
But a lot of countries just decide not to.
I was going to say because they're like, and we were like, so it's definitely that.
A lot of countries just decide it's quite expensive to take part.
Is it?
Do you know, the national broadcasters have to pay and stuff, and like.
Do you know why Bosnia is not in the EU?
No.
Because they owe Eurovision money.
Really? And they said you can't compete anymore.
Yeah, until you pay back what you owe us.
I think it's interesting, and I think he would have been added to the board for this had he competed. But the Vatican can technically compete because their Vatican radio is part of the EBU, and that's the only thing you have to do to require. So next year we could have some dancing cardinals, get the Pope some airtime, new Pope.
He's pretty fresh.
Publicity.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's a good shout. I'd support it.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis would have struggled, but I think Leo's got it.
Yeah.
100%.
No, American. They don't even know what Eurovision is.
Yeah, but it could be like an Israel situation. Do you know what I mean? You could get boosted
True.
by the pro-American vote.
Okay, maybe. We'll look back on this in a year's time. Join us again next week when we will move more people up, more people down, and probably talk about the Eurovision Song Contest slightly less.
Hopefully.
Or more.
Hopefully more.
Hopefully more.